G'day everyone, welcome to our latest Spa Takeaway. I'm Matt Dean, the CEO of Screen Producers Australia. Thank you so much for all your engagement across this week and the previous weeks about this. We've been loving talking to everyone from different perspectives about how they're being affected and their plans and their thoughts, and there's a lot to talk about given that the government dropped a discussion paper last week. And I think that was a really healthy conversation yesterday. We're going to be talking to Jeffrey Walker and Dan Reid, different elements of industry, a great director, Dan who looks after film finances this week as well. And we are going to be also running through the discussion paper as a Facebook Live exercise with Holly Brimble, who's our Director of Policy, on Friday. So people that want to engage with us that way and listen to what we have to say, that'd be awesome. Now, look, I'm not going to beat around the bush. I'm really excited to talk today to Tony Burke, the Shadow Minister for the Arts. Thank you so much for being a part of our conversation today, Tony.
G'day, Matt.
And look, it looks like you're not at home. Look like you're in a formal office. But are you doing all right? Are you over in Sydney or are you somewhere else?
I'm in Punchbowl, but both the office and home are Punchbowl. Okay. So, yeah, it's there's a problem doing something like this at home simply because the home is also another office and a classroom, which intermittently becomes a war zone with an Xbox. So.
I was going to say, some of the challenges of doing these things, you've got to make sure no one's using all the streaming everywhere around the house so that you've actually got a bit of a clean line of sight. But anyway, it's good. It's great to see you. I know we've had a couple of chances to talk, both with your office and on a roundtable you've been conducting each week with broader arts community, including us, and we really appreciate your engagement. I thought, though, before we dive into some of the specifics of the industry, and we have seen you being one of the people that can go down to camera when it's been sitting and fighting the fight as you do in different ways. I'm interested in your perspective of how are we looking? How is the government operating from your lens? And of course, you know, you're sitting in opposition, but this is a time when I think there's been an attempt to meld strategy and to keep things going for the country, given how serious it is. So I wanted to give you an opportunity just to tell us what your overview and thoughts are of how we're travelling at the moment.
Look, there's a whole lot of good that is happening at the moment, and I don't think, in any sense of criticism, we should overlook that. So the government's done a few things that historically they've been very uncomfortable with. And they've done that in the context of the crisis, and that's a good thing. So, for example, the fact that the effective new start rate has been doubled this period makes a real difference to people who are finding themselves on the job seeker payment. The fact that we have a wage subsidy at all is something that the government at the start of these debates was fiercely resisting, and we were pushing it. And Scott Morrison was ruling it out absolutely. The fact that they got there to the concept of a wage subsidy is a really good thing.
Yeah.
So I don't want the conversation about who's missing out to forget that there are millions of people who, in the context of this crisis, would have been quite destitute, where the government has done a good thing in including them.
Yes.
The challenge now is to make sure that we're not leaving people behind. And, I guess a whole lot of the advocacy I've been making in the arts and entertainment sector is that for neither job seeker nor job keeper, there's not a neat fit there. And that means a whole lot of the people who were in many ways the first to be shut down and in some perspectives will be some of the last to get back on their feet, to have them through this period without a program that actually is fit for purpose should be unthinkable, but right at the moment, that's where we are.
Let's tackle that and the arts sector particularly before we then probably jump into the screen sector. But before we do that, I wanted to... IR is one of your areas, and this has been that incredibly difficult period where IR is actually at the core of many issues associated with industrial relations, are at the core of trying to solve problems as we've gone into this transition for our economy. And I'm interested in how busy you are maybe dealing with that part of your portfolio. And from our perspective, this is a we were just mentioning it before, that this is something that we've had to do a lot of work around, and I give credit to Paul Murphy at the MEAA because we've been able to try to work through what's a really difficult process of figuring out how to approach this, and now also looking at how we can possibly get people back to work in the best way. So I'm interested in your thoughts and what's been happening across the whole economy with IR issues before we get into arts.
Look, at the moment, the thing that is different to any other downturn is the job losses that are happening at the moment are not because there's a lack of confidence in the economy. They're because there's been a government decision to shut businesses down. And that is completely different. So normally when people are losing their jobs or a company's having to let go of staff, the first thing you say is, oh, okay, well, economically, do they need to restructure? What were the weaknesses in the company? Businesses that were completely strong and intact have been shut down for a period of time.
Yes.
And that means where industrial relations in times of crisis is normally about, okay, how do we get the next job for someone? The big shift at the moment is how do we keep the same job for that person a few months down the track? And so the question that we're asking in industrial relations at the moment is fundamentally different.
Yes.
To the conversations we normally have when a workplace shuts down. There is nothing about structural weakness. There is nothing about reorganising the economy. The line that the PM has used, which I think is right, is sort of the ideal situation, is when he talks about hibernation. Yeah, you want businesses, if they have to sleep during this time, to survive and then wake up and everything's back as close as possible as to where it previously was. And yeah, that's, I guess, why we've gone so hard on wanting to find an outcome for Virgin. Because here's a business that before the crisis was flying, was running, employing 16,000 people. At the other end of this, we don't want to suddenly find Australia's become a monopoly player again. We know what that means for fares. We know what that means for regions. We know what it means for jobs. So there's a whole lot of policy levers that for a normal downturn you wouldn't go near. But this time they become everything, because if we're going to snap back or click back or whatever the PM's term is, there are things you need to do now to make sure that happens.
Yes.
Some of them they're doing, but I don't think anyone honestly could say they're doing enough that snapback's going to become possible.
Do you see that that's the next thing then, in terms of an overall work that either is happening or needs to be happening, and that's the packages that will get the country actually back to work? And ignoring the fact that we started to talk about arts and entertainment, but is that really the big picture thing that the government is doing or needs to be doing?
It's the next conversation. I've been reluctant to get too much into that conversation before we fix the first one.
Right.
Because your policies around how do we snap back, how do we get everyone back to work, collapse if in the intervening time a series of companies that you wanted to bounce back have in fact disappeared.
Yes.
That a series of businesses have completely lost contact and lost touch with their workforce because their workforce have had to go off somewhere else during this period of time.
Yes.
So that's where, yes, I want to have that conversation, but I want to make sure we've got the foundations for it right. And
Yes.
at the moment, I've got to say we're close, but for millions of people, we don't have it yet.
And look, before we even, I'm holding off on the piece of conversation we really want to get into, but I do want to ask the question. There's perception, I suppose, that look, the unions have been dealt in for a change, and that there's conversations going on with the workers and others in a different way than has happened previously. I mean, I guess our sector's just still reeling a bit from the pausing or of the quotas that was announced last week. And look, reading mostly negative things into that, and we're trying to work through it as to the outcome. But it reminded me of the idea that you'd never waste a crisis, and that the sort of the maybe ungenerous view of this would be to say, well, actually, is there an agenda that's going to be happening now that we've gotten through this first wave that you can see more broadly across a lot of things because we've got a crisis. That means we can do the things that we were holding back doing because maybe there was greater scrutiny or there was a sort of a set of resistance that was normally in place and lobbying and others. And I guess it's a concern that I'm just picking up from the sector, and I'm wondering what you're seeing.
I'm worried about it. I'm worried. We haven't seen the meat on the bones of where they're wanting to head yet. But if you take where your question started about the level of cooperation we're seeing at the moment with unions being dealt into the conversation again, which the extraordinary thing, which never was considered a story, was when they got dealt out. Like when Labor's been in government, you deal with business and with unions. When the coalition's been in government, you deal with business alone. It's been a silly way to operate. And so the fact that they are allowing the representatives of employees to be at the table again is a good thing. It's bizarre that it ever wasn't the case. But the next challenge, I guess, becomes whether or not they see the goodwill that's there at the moment and the level of cooperation to be something that continues during the rebuild, or whether it's something that they take advantage of when they needed it and then abandon it and revert back to type.
Right.
And I'm worried at the moment that they're going to revert to type.
And what are the signals you're seeing? Why would you think that at the moment?
When they... Look, it depends how you read the word deregulation.
Right.
Okay, if deregulation is additional, getting rid of additional paperwork that wasn't making a substantive difference, then I get that, and that's something that both sides of politics should be pursuing all the time.
Yes.
If deregulation is about getting rid of safety nets, then you got to think, oh, hang on, now it might be a safety net for workplace health and safety. It might be a safety net for family budgets. It might be a safety net for environmental protection, or it might be a safety net for Australian content. But if it's a safety net, then it's there for a policy purpose. And to view it through the lens of red tape means, as a nation, we stand to lose a lot on the way through.
Okay, and I guess on the content front, I'm nervous that is a bit of red tape we needed to continue for various reasons, and I think I've expressed those views very publicly. Let's get into the crux of the arts and entertainment industry. You were sort of probably, in some ways, the live performance community were the ones sounding an alarm bell 4 weeks before probably the rest of the community was figuring out what was going on with this thing, right? There was a series of hang-ons, which caught everyone a little bit off guard, but they were at the coalface or the canary in the mine or whatever you want to say. And so there's some learnings from that, and then I think we felt we came online quickly as everything went grinding shut for most productions straight away. So we're all now in the same bucket, and I think we're a sector that feels, and look, through the leadership, I suppose, of many different people, has been making its case quite proudly and strongly, using a lot of the communication strengths of our industry, but hasn't necessarily landed a goal in any sense in cutting through here. I'm interested in what your thoughts are around that. What has been the thing that's been compelling or not compelling about our case broadly in terms of maybe sector-specific support? And where are you seeing other sectors be more successful, perhaps, as a way of contrasting?
Yeah, as you say, it's exactly the chronology that you just described, Matt. So the first thing that we were hearing were the big festivals around the world. So I remember people saying Coachella's not happening. And then locally it was Splendour and Blues Fest. And
some of your favourite festivals. Yes.
That's right. That's exactly. No, I'm feeling it.
I know. I know you.
And so they started to shut down. And straight away, what was happening was businesses that were completely viable and artists who weren't at the fringe, full working artists who had gigs lined up for the year. In the space of about 2 media conferences that would have gone for half an hour each, they watched half a year's work disappear.
Wow.
It just went full.
Yes.
And then we had a period where there was a complaint we weren't getting clear messages from the PM and people saying, just tell us what we need to do. Finally, the clarity hit, and that's what we're now dealing with. So it was the exact order. The I thought because particularly Life Performance was the first to be hit, that they'd be in with a rescue package quickly. So it never occurred to me that weeks and months later we'd still be talking in these terms. I guess so. Added to that, the sectors that have been successful, effectively, and I guess the more aggressive and strong the relevant minister has been, the better the package has turned out to be.
Okay.
So, while I'm his opponent in industrial relations, no one would argue that Christian Porter's a lightweight. And when he was personally convinced on the issues of wage subsidy and what it meant at the workplace, it didn't take too long for the Prime Minister and the Treasurer to be on board, even though they'd been fiercely resisting it.
Right.
Similarly, the Education Minister has made sure that while it's not perfect, we've got a package for the childcare sector that's pretty extraordinary. We started off with a really good aviation package and that had the Deputy Prime Minister pushing for it, although it ended up being not quite as it seemed, because most of that money was waiving fees that would only apply if the planes were in the air, and now the planes aren't in the air. So a lot of that money under the current model won't in fact be spent. But effectively, the minister we've got, who I think most people, when they meet, he's quite a likeable bloke, Paul Fletcher. Whatever authority he might have at the table, he's not using it. I can't imagine a way that an arts minister could do less during a crisis like this. That's no character assessment. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but if I think, is there any way you could do less as a government than what they've currently done? I don't think there is. And yeah, you go.
No, I was going to say, let's break it down then in terms of what it is that is the gaps for people, and maybe what you would be considering at this point, maybe, because that's a way to look at the pathways and perhaps the nudges we could give it. So at the moment, we know that there is, I think the government wanted to set up a broad economic package through JobKeeper and Job Seeker, but we know that this industry broadly has challenges with JobKeeper and Job Seeker, that some people don't at all fall into Job Seeker because of the way that they operate and the relativity of the way they're employed or being employed. And that might change, I suppose, in their employment terms later. But I don't quite understand all of those elements, but I know that Job Keeper rather is a little bit hamstrung by the problem of smaller project work that a lot of the sector in the arts community has, and it therefore doesn't match up and marry through, that you can sit in with what is a normally, employed situation for people. A lot of people are freelancers and others, and I don't know if there's an own goal that people have kicked by not, registering ABNs in the past and all these other things that now they go, just as a whole industry, we need to have learnt to have done a different thing, or whether there was and is something that needed to be done immediately. And I think you tried to have a motion passed, didn't you, to extend that package. So that was probably your first initiative that you were thinking about in opposition when that package was going through. Do you want to talk us through what the goal was there?
Yeah, we tried it in two different ways. One was to have a resolution of the Parliament for the government to bring in a comprehensive package. And once that was defeated, then we sought to amend the JobKeeper rules so that the Treasurer would have to take into account, when he sets the different rules, the specific challenges of this industry. In terms of the comprehensive package, it goes to something that we haven't tended to talk about, but the large elements of the sector entered the crisis already weakened because of the cuts that have happened ever since the George Brandis days. So the cuts in particular to Australia Council and Screen Australia, but it's been broader than that in terms of the impact on the ecology of the sector. That meant we arrived at the crisis weaker than the sector should have been. There was still a series of companies that were themselves very strong, still some incredible work being churned out and produced. But I don't think we can pretend that we didn't enter it weaker than we We really should have. Um, the next thing, though, we wanted something comprehensive that would deal with that full range of issues. When that didn't happen, we then sought to amend JobKeeper. The challenge with JobKeeper, and I'm not critical for the government about the government in announcing it this way initially, because let's face it, they did it in a rush. You know, they had spent weeks saying absolutely no way, Labor's wrong, unions are wrong, business is wrong, it's the wrong thing to do, to then saying, yep, we're going to do it, and then 4 days later or something, or 5 days later, we're in the parliament. So you can understand that they were going to miss things out. But effectively, what they'd originally leaked to the papers was that it was only going to apply to full-timers. And they realised pretty quickly that that would be a disaster. And so they started to broaden it, and they just didn't broaden it far enough. So you end up with casuals who, you know, take the casuals holding a camera, who will work all year and will have been holding often the same camera, sometimes different cameras that are hired each time, but will have been doing that work for 5 years, but have always been employed as casuals.
Yes, on different
in doing that work.
Yes.
Yeah. So a rule that you've got to have been doing it for 12 months. Well, they have been, but the moment you say, oh, no, but it's got to be the same employer, it just doesn't understand how this industry works. And a whole lot of actors who had forward contracts where the shoot was coming up, you know, companies will want to keep the relationship with the people who they booked for the shoot.
Yes.
And so if you can keep that relationship going, that means that everything's ready to go. You're not doing all the programming schedules and diary schedules that'd be challenging on the other side. If you've kept that relationship in place, by saying, no, 12 months with the one company or you're out, means those relationships get shot to pieces. And once you get told, okay, you can start again, well, that doesn't mean that people can turn up to the shoot. That means that's when your members are saying, okay, how do I start getting the people together?
Yes. I've done this analogy of talking about us needing to create lots of planes that are full with people, but having them ready on the tarmac, not that the people are at home, waiting to get it to the airport to then reload the plane, because you need to get the planes often in the air and flying as a way of thinking about productions we do. So, yes, I completely agree with you. Look, on the basis, and maybe we can't go back in time now, but that hasn't been successful, and it's very unlikely they're going to amend this further, right? In terms of expanding.
I want to be sure of that.
All right, okay.
Be sure of that. The legislation that they took to the Parliament very deliberately from the government gave the Treasurer full flexibility to change the rules at any time.
Okay.
So it doesn't need to go back to the Parliament. There's no humiliating debate for the Prime Minister of, oh, yeah, you should have fixed this at the start. Treasurer can fix this at any point.
Okay.
We legislated to give that full power to one person, and he just does it by regulation and it's done. And
in the processes of government, do you think that this is the way that this will work, will be our minister needing to make representations to the Treasurer for this sector, or is it a broader set of casuals and others that ultimately will need to come to the Treasurer as a sort of a combined industry exercise? Like, how do you think the tactics of working within the government would work to be able to push an amendment like that through?
I think it's effectively your own members and their businesses going directly both to Paul Fletcher and to Josh Frydenberg.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you've got to be being heard in both places.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't rule it out. And one of the challenges with all of this, and I think this is one of the things that I guess I've worked with the sector for a lot of years now, right back to when I was minister. But I think in the minds of a lot of people within the government, the sector is not about businesses and workers. The sector is about people doing what they would regard as a hobby. And I just think that's part of the mindset. And to explain the commercial reality is part of winning the argument.
Yes. Look, it's something that we take on seriously in terms of trying to analyse, provide data, all of those things. I do think there's a hearts and minds story which you'd hope was a given, but sometimes it isn't. But you've really got to go in with the numbers and the economics around this sector all the time. I'm interested in. Look, I take on board with maybe there's the expansion of the broader industry measure, but we are looking at the moment we've positioned for money to come to the sector, or we're asking that money come to the sector through either a series of ideas, increasing the offset so that we can get the planes off quicker, more fuel in the tank, if you like, so the planes can load up quicker, and in the absence of commercial dollars that may be there, maybe more a top up to Screen Australia. And we are looking at even the idea of underwriting or having a pool of funds to deal with the risk of insurance problems that are going to be very hard with a pre-existing COVID-19 situation that people will not insure against. So we're asking for more money, industry-specific money. Most of it's couched through the idea of that second stage of getting, what we can do to lift the industry up. I'm interested in whether you think whether there's any angles in here that you think are going to be more effective than not. And maybe you touched on it with the economic layer. But we are needing to fight for what is going to be a clear line of sight into government, whether it, with our minister, with others, with ideally an agitation point opposition can provide as well, and have a very effective message around this. And I am, maybe your advice to give to sector, if you've got any things to suggest as part of that, because I think that people would love to see that, especially in a situation where that pipeline has been paused from the minister's announcement last week through the sub-quota being ceased. They want to see and know that there's something potentially to keep themselves moving out of this mess at some point. So I'm interested in what you think might be effective in this area.
I think it's really important that we get an announcement from the government that the quota pause, let's say, let's hope all it is, a public announcement from them that it will be lifted on X date. Because to be able to get your forward contracts from your broadcasters, that why would they if they don't know what those rules are going to be into the future? So to get a long lead time on them being lifted, I think is really important. The second thing with that is for, as industry, to go to government with effectively your list of, because the day they end restrictions is the day you can start a shoot, technically.
Yes.
So it's how do you get everything ready during this period up to that moment? Yes. To make sure that you've got the investment and everything ready to go, so that next part of it can be done. And I don't know the dollars of that, but that's
what
for you to put the government.
Like. Yeah, I think that one of the things we've seen is that the agencies are talking about supporting supercharged development, but a lot of that development is contingent on the idea that there's someone who wants the money to be used for something at the end point. And with those sub-quotas gone, look, it doesn't diminish the fact that there are some great entertainment programs that can be made and other things, but we know that there's a big chunk of people that do work in drama, particularly in children's content and documentary, that are not going to see that. And in the absence, I suppose, of any sort of additional support, and indeed a slightly, you'd say, if I'm being generous, weakened ABC, there's not another pipeline for people domestically. And of course, we've talked about this. I think we talked about it on the first time I ever properly engaged with you. I think it was in a debate with George Brandis. We had a breakfast in Parliament House, and we were talking about SVOD regulation at that point. And you were, I think, anticipating a time when we would be watching apps on TVs, and it was like, what are we talking? Of course, we are all doing that. It's apps on TVs. We're watching television completely differently, and indeed the SVODs are not regulated. So this is the moment, I would have thought, to strike. And I don't know what your thoughts are, whether the Labor Party's officially come to a conclusion about this. I won't push you too hard, but that is.
Oh, no. But look, I'll say, as you know, and I've said publicly right back to that forum when I was minister with the debate against Brandis. My view is that we need to make sure Australian the interaction that we want to keep is between the person on their lounge and the Australian content.
Yes.
That interaction isn't dependent on whether or not the signal arrived through broadcast or Wi-Fi.
Yes. Yes.
And it's the interaction that we want of people with their stories. So my view has always been, if we're going to talk about having a level playing field, it's about guaranteeing the Australian content on the streaming services. It's not about abandoning broadcasting and saying, oh, well, because someone else is undercutting, you can now undercut too. Now, can I say that was an easier argument commercially to run when I was running it back then, 7 or 8 years ago now, because that was before one of the commercial operators had taken a stake in Stan. And so you've got a whole lot of different interests now where the longer we leave it, the harder this will be to fix.
Yes.
And there are different ways of getting inside it, but the principle of we need to guarantee the same level of Australian content if you're using a streaming service as if it's broadcasting, I think is a given. I say this also, as a selfish consumer of our stories. I spent the first part of this hibernation period or whatever completely absorbed bunkered down watching Stateless.
Yes.
And started this week on Mystery Road.
Yes.
The quality of what we're producing is phenomenal, just phenomenal.
No.
But I don't pretend for a minute that the ecology that has produced all the talent that goes together for those programs would have been possible if we didn't have quotas.
Yes.
It just wouldn't have been.
No, it's the safety net that you've talked about. That I think people. There are a couple of questions coming through, and I will get to them. But if there are others, please send them through. I wanted to. I didn't want to miss the opportunity to talk to you about the strategy and the way forward on essentially a lot of different stakeholders that disagree on how the content quotas and other mechanisms should work for them going forward. And you touched on it, so I thought, you're right. The problem, for example, that Free TV has is that it's now got it's always probably had variations of agreement and disagreement between its major players, but you can imagine a world in which there will be a resistance by Nine potentially, or Fairfax 9, to have it may be proven wrong in what comes through, but in SVOD regulation, that may be also the situation for 10 if they see that there is a negative for them moving as they are in CBS sort of world to an online environment. 7, I think, has taken the view over the years that it isn't in that space and it won't be for a while, so it looks for an opportunity to have that regulation. So that world is a compromised world in terms of agreement around SVODs. I think the production industry is aligned entirely on that. And I don't know if you're making these Sophie's choices around who gets to, what are the options, all the things, and maybe you have had a chance to read the options paper already that the Minister put out, but there are a set of, almost conflicting choices that one needs to make, and there are winners and losers in that. And one of the challenges, I'm rambling now, but one of the challenges I felt in the paper is that there aren't a set of guiding principles to say, we want this, this and this from this work. We want a series of these outcomes for the industry. I'm interested in how you'd be approaching this at the moment. If you were, wearing I know you're not, but if you're wearing the hat of the Minister, how would you be approaching essentially this grand harmonisation exercise and competing players?
Okay, well, the first thing I don't think you can do is just say, okay, who's doing it tough? Let's try to help them out there. There is no doubt that at the moment the commercial stations are under pressure in ways they haven't been before. No doubt. But to say, well, let's fix their problem by creating a problem for other smaller Australian businesses who are the production companies, I don't think it's the way to handle it. But I think the way you guide yourself in every policy debate, and I've tried to keep to this, is you go right back to first principles. Like, you can get absorbed in the detail and the mess, but you've got to get to your first principles and what they are. Now, for me, I know what they are for me. For me, it's making sure our stories are told. And I want the relationship between the viewer and the story to be something that continues and keeps getting stronger. I want it to be the way that we present ourselves to each other and to the world. Most drama that I've ever watched, I've been watching the stories of other people. Stateless, some of what I was watching, I first became Shadow Minister for Immigration during the Cornelia Rao period.
Yes.
So that's the first time I've watched something and thought that I'm part of this story in different ways, and really knew it and knew some of the people. But not every story will be some sort of historic narrative. I'm not pretending that. It doesn't need to be. But the fact that it's told in our way, through our lens, is something that has a value in its own right.
Yes.
And, true of the documentary sector as well. And so I just think if you have that as your guiding principle, then you look at each of the options differently.
Yes.
Because you look at the options in terms of what does this mean for the relationship between the Australian community and their stories being told. And you'll always land in the right place. And the different commercial pressures will be something that you weigh up, but you weigh them up in the context of making sure that the relationship between the community and their stories survives and gets stronger. Get that right, and I don't think you can go wrong.
And I think you're touching on the idea that that is the outcome. It may be that there's, failures of various sorts, market failure that won't allow for that, but that is where government steps in to intervene, both in commercial terms and in, commercial terms in dollars and in assistance of sort, and indeed in insistence of outcome. I think there's always been that balance between investment and regulation to make those guiding things happen. I think that's certainly, it's had me thinking about how we best engage with the process at play, and I think we need to establish what we think are from at least our perspective, the principles that we think we need to address and the government needs to address as part of this. And I don't think we're also trying to find middle grounds, because I think the challenge for our businesses are that they are working with and needing to be good commercial partners with broadcasters. They're only as able to work if the broadcasters are commissioning and working as well. So this is the fine line and balance and the dance that is done internally in the industry, where there may be opposing views actually, but we need different parts to actually come together and not be at loggerheads the whole time, because our outcomes are wedded to the broadcasters' outcomes, and in some ways, in many ways, and probably in most ways, the broadcasters' outcomes are wedded to the success of the production industry. So anyway, let me get to the questions that are happening so that I can deal with this. Ross has asked a question, and this is a bigger question. Tell us about the demand. I've asked the question, why has the opposition not demanded, it may not be that you haven't demanded, a return to Parliament to discuss this and other issues? I think he was asking that question a little bit ago, but it may have been relating to a broader conversation we're having. But has there been attempts to, and I think I've seen them, but to bring the Parliament more into a current sitting schedule so that there's greater discussion and debate currently, or is there an agreement that we should be not in Parliament at the moment?
No. We've been demanding the regular sitting calendar from the moment the government put that the Parliament wouldn't be meeting. I was on my feet opposing it. We had more speeches from Labor. Jim Chalmers spoke in opposition. We voted against the changes, and we've continued, whenever asked in moments like this and in media conferences, to consistently say the Parliament should be meeting, really should be meeting. And yes, this is one of the reasons why. But can I say it's part of it's just part of the nature of the job is we're responsible for what we say. We're not responsible for what makes it onto the news. Yes. We don't get to make that choice. So I can understand that, even though from my perspective, it's something I've been saying repeatedly, social media, general media, pushing as much as I can, there'll still be some people who haven't heard it.
Yeah. There's another question. Paul's asked the question around what would be the way in which we would be, because I think the minister's able to make the decision unilaterally to suspend the quotas. We haven't really dug into this, but maybe there'll be some inquiries around this from Labor. But what is the way in which we would be, or the opposition could pressure a return to the quotas? Because I don't know that I myself have not delved into this, and maybe you haven't either, but the mechanism that the minister's used and the degree to which that can be challenged or indeed coaxed for a change, not only industry, I think, as you said, standing up for that and saying, well, we need a proper clear mechanism for returning this, but and maybe that'll be better as we've seen a production overnight. I think Neighbours announcing it's coming back online, and MasterChef. So more productions will help pressure that. But I'm just thinking about the legal framework in which the ministers operate at the moment. Have you delved into this?
I'm not aware of anything on this one that comes before the Parliament.
Right.
And this is where people often say with different issues, why can't you stop this? And the truth with some issues is you can build public pressure, but ultimately there are some things that you can only change with a change of government. And that's not a partisan point. That's just a reality. In terms of the importance of stories and how the whole sector fits together, I think we're seeing on pretty grand display at the moment that there is a difference between the parties and their views on this sector. There is. You get a chance once every 3 years to change that, and last time we didn't get there.
One of the things that maybe is worth thinking about is, I think in my experience, and I've been doing policy work in this area generally for different people for 20 years or so, but there has been a gradual provision of ultimate decision making in this area to the minister to make decisions. It was originally lots of areas were given to the ACMA to make decisions at an arm's length, and I think for political reasons probably more than ever, and I'd imagine it's been the outcome of, say, broadcasters to make this sitting in the minister's office rather than an independent authority. I'm wondering whether Labor's got a view about the idea of letting that come away from the minister's ultimate determination. It's possibly a little early to be speculating around this policy work, but I see it as a problem where I go, actually a lot of the reasons we can't move on things is in other territories like the UK, the Ofcom, the British regulator, can actually do its own reviews. It can sort shit out. It can do, and this is all log jammed with a minister, and then you get all of the pressure and lobbying and machinery and very large proprietors and squeaky wheels, like possibly more in the arts community, sort of having a fight and trying to get things done that way. And in this instance, you've got a decision that's made unilaterally, perhaps not without a degree of either overview perhaps. It could be I think there's a way to review these things in some legislative terms, or to have a third party do it with a ministerial overview.
Yeah, can I say, look, it'd be more Michelle Rowland than me who'd have carriage of that particular decision. But as a general rule, when we're in opposition, I often get people saying, can't we take these decisions out of the hands of ministers? Can't we have an independent authority and all of that? We saw in a different area with the authority for safe rates for truck drivers. The moment the independent authority made a decision the government didn't like, they just abolished the authority. Right. Ultimately, you cannot constitutionally completely remove the legislators from these decisions. Right. You can have another body that's making the decisions, but the capacity of the parliament to then intervene if they don't like it will always be there. That doesn't mean you don't have some independent authorities. You do. But, it's like I had a very strong view about the independence of the Australia Council and Screen Australia, and that a minister should never intervene. How did George Brandis get around that? He just defunded them and put the money into a pot that he had control over. So a lot of these things come down to election decisions where people make their judgment about how in the future ministers will behave.
All right, we've left it at almost a technical frame, but I didn't want to miss the beat of saying that one of the things that I've known of you, and you wear it on your sleeve, your music love, your love of performance, your active engagement with artists, your personal in relationships with a lot of people. You walk the walk, I think, in both in consumption and indeed in your passion for the sector. So look, as a broad way of saying that, thank you very much for your interest, and you couldn't hope for a better set of advocates on opposition benches for us. So thank you very much, Tony, for all your work.
No, thanks, Matt, and thanks to you and your members for what you do.
No worries. Thank you, mate. And look, that's a nice way to wrap up. We will. I'm sorry we've gone a bit over, but it was a great chance to have a bit of a detailed conversation. We'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow. And as I say, we'll be exploring the options paper on Friday a bit earlier in the day. That's all online, all in our events section. Until then, look after yourselves and look after each other.